Imagine this. A highly skilled doctor, revered by his peers, is suddenly thrust into a battle that could destroy everything he's worked for. After saving a life, he's accused of negligence and racial bias, his entire career at stake. In a world where perception can outweigh truth, can he prove his innocence or will prejudice tear him down? The clock is ticking and the fight for justice is about to begin. If you are new here, then please subscribe this channel and show thumbs up by liking the video. Now let's move to this wonderful story. Dr. Samuel Richards adjusted the surgical mask on his face, his fingers trembling slightly as he did so. The hospital was buzzing with activity, yet all he could focus on was the patient lying on the operating table in front of him. The fluorescent lights above flickered occasionally, casting a sterile glow across the operating room. The air was thick with the scent of antiseptic, and the rhythmic beeping of monitors provided a strange sense of comfort. This was his world, a world where life and death balanced precariously on a scalpel. It had been a long night, but Dr. Richards remained calm and focused. He had been on call for the past 12 hours, and now a woman named Clara Anderson lay in front of him, her life hanging by a thread. She was in her late 50s and her abdomen had ruptured after a fall. The surgery she needed was delicate, and if things went wrong, her chances of survival were slim. Dr. Richards had always been drawn to surgery for moments like this, the quiet intensity of the operating room, where everything else fades away, and all that matters is the patient. As one of the few black surgeons at the hospital, he had always known that he was under more scrutiny than most. But none of that mattered when he was in the operating room. Here it was just him, his team, and the patient. He moved with precision, his hands steady despite the hours of exhaustion weighing on him. "Scalpel," he called, his voice steady. A nurse quickly placed the instrument in his palm and he made the incision, his mind focusing solely on the task at hand. The sound of his team moving around him was almost soothing as they worked in perfect harmony. He was used to this rhythm now, the quiet urgency of life or death moments. "Vitals are stable," the anesthesiologist called from his post, his eyes glued to the monitors. The news was good. Clara's condition was holding steady, but there was no room for error. Dr. Richards nodded and adjusted his focus. They were close to finishing, but the hardest part was still ahead. Hours passed, but time seemed irrelevant as Dr. Richards worked tirelessly, closing the incision with careful precision. The room was quiet except for the sound of machines and the occasional murmurs of his team. His thoughts drifted for a moment as he worked, his mind briefly flicking back to the reason he had become a surgeon in the first place. This was what he had dreamed of, helping people, saving lives. But he knew that outside the operating room, things weren't always as simple. The last few stitches were in place and he stepped back, finally allowing himself to exhale. The surgery was over. Clara was stable. "Well done, everyone," Dr. Richards said, his voice filled with quiet pride. His team offered tired but grateful nods in return. They had done it. They had saved a life. As he removed his gloves and stepped out of the operating room, a wave of exhaustion hit him. The long hours, the constant pressure, it was all catching up to him now. But there was also a sense of satisfaction, a small victory in a world where success was often fleeting. But as Dr. Richards walked down the hospital corridors, the feeling of relief slowly began to fade, replaced by something else. He had saved another life, but there was still a weight on his shoulders. It was a weight he couldn't shake. He had grown used to it over the years, used to the whispers, the glances, the unspoken judgments. It didn't matter how many lives he saved. There would always be some who saw him as different. It didn't matter how skilled he was, how many surgeries he performed successfully. To some people, he would always be just the black doctor. The hospital wasn't unfamiliar with his struggles. Some colleagues were supportive, while others kept their distance. But the real challenge was the patients, the ones who didn't see Dr. Richards as a doctor, but as something else entirely. It was a constant reminder that even in a place where lives were saved, some things were still determined by the color of his skin. As he reached the staff room, his pager buzzed on. His hip, he glanced down at the flashing number. It was from the emergency room. Another case. His muscles tensed and he sighed, feeling the weight of another long night ahead. The hospital never slept, and as one of the senior surgeons on call, neither did he. When he arrived at the emergency department, chaos greeted him. Nurses rushed from one patient to the next, and the steady hum of machines filled the air. "Dr. Richards," a nurse called out, her face urgent. She handed him a clipboard with the details of the new case. "We've got a critical case. Emily Reed, 58 years old, collapsed at home. It looks like an abdominal rupture. She's losing blood fast." Dr. Richards's mind shifted into action. His exhaustion momentarily forgotten, he moved with purpose. "Prep her for surgery," he ordered, his voice calm but firm. There was no time to waste. As he followed the team into the emergency bay, his thoughts momentarily flicked back to Clara Anderson. Another life on the line, another chance to make a difference. But as he glanced down at the new patient, Emily Reed, he couldn't shake the feeling that the battles he faced weren't just in the operating room. They were all around him. This would be his reality, day in and day out, saving lives, fighting for recognition, fighting for respect. And though he knew his purpose was to heal, to save, a part of him wondered if he could ever escape the shadow of prejudice that seemed to follow him wherever he went. But for now, the surgery called, and he would answer. Dr. Samuel Richards had just finished a long shift when his pager buzzed again. The hospital never seemed to rest, and neither did he. His body ached with fatigue, but the thought of another critical case jolted him into action. He was on his way to the emergency room when his mind momentarily drifted back to the surgery he had just completed. Clara Anderson was stable now, her life saved. But it didn't feel like a victory. Not when the world outside the operating room had its own set of rules. Rules that often ignored his skills in favor of the color of his skin. He shook the thought away as he pushed open the emergency room door. The scene before him was chaotic but controlled. Doctors and nurses moved with urgency, responding to the cries and beeps of machines. The tension was palpable as they worked to stabilize patients. In critical condition, a nurse hurried toward him with a clipboard in hand, her face tight with urgency. "Dr. Richards," she said quickly, "we've got a critical case. Emily Reed, 58 years old, collapsed at home, possible abdominal rupture. Blood pressure is dangerously low. We need you in the operating room immediately." Dr. Richards nodded, his mind already shifting into surgeon mode. He didn't have time to feel the exhaustion in his body. Every second mattered. He followed the nurse to the bay where Emily Reed lay unconscious, her body pale and limp. Her vitals were failing, and there was no time to waste. Her condition was critical, and she needed immediate surgery. "Prep her for surgery," Dr. Richards ordered, his voice steady as he adjusted his surgical gloves. "Let's move quickly." As the team worked, Dr. Richards reviewed Emily's medical history: high blood pressure, diabetes, and previous surgeries. None of that mattered now. She was on the table, her life hanging in the balance. He could feel the weight of the situation settling in, his mind focused on the task at hand, but a small voice in the back of his mind reminded him that no matter how hard he worked, no matter how many lives he saved, there were people who would always see him as something less than a doctor, less than a professional. The surgery was long and grueling. Hours passed as Dr. Richards and his team navigated the complications that arose from Emily's underlying conditions. At one point, they faced a moment of tension when the bleeding wouldn't stop. His hands remained steady, his focus unshaken, as he continued to work. The anesthesiologist called out updates, and slowly, bit by bit, Emily's condition began to stabilize. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the surgery ended. Dr. Richards stepped back, wiping the sweat from his brow. "She's stable," he said, his voice calm despite the intensity of the operation. "We need to monitor her closely, but she's going to make it." His team gave tired but satisfied nods. Another life saved. But as Dr. Richards peeled off his gloves and left the operating room, the sense of relief he expected didn't come. Instead, a deep weariness settled over him. He had saved her, yes. But the truth was, he wasn't sure how much longer he could keep fighting the battles that came with his job, battles that weren't just about his medical expertise. The hospital Corridors seemed quieter now, the only sound being the distant hum of machines. As Dr. Richards made his way to Emily's recovery room, he reminded himself to focus on her recovery. This was what he had trained for, what he had sacrificed for. This was his life, saving people, one surgery at a time. But when he entered Emily's room, he was met with an unexpected confrontation. Emily's eyes fluttered open, and as her gaze locked onto Dr. Richards, her face twisted into a sneer. She blinked a few times, confusion written across her face as she adjusted to her surroundings. But that confusion quickly turned into something else, something sharp and hostile. "You?" she spat, her voice hoarse but filled with disdain. "I want a real doctor. Get me someone else." The words hit Dr. Richards like a slap in the face. It wasn't the first time he had faced such prejudice, but it never got easier. He had spent years earning his place as a surgeon. He had saved countless lives. But in that moment, none of that mattered to Emily. All she saw was the color of his skin, not his abilities. Dr. Richards stood there trying to process what had just happened. He had just saved this woman's life, and yet she was refusing his care simply because he was black. The sting of her words was sharp, but he forced himself to remain calm. He had learned to fight through moments like this, but it didn't make it any less painful. "I am your doctor," he said, his voice steady but tinged with frustration. "I performed your surgery. You're stable now and we're monitoring your recovery closely." Emily's face twisted in disgust, and she pulled the blanket tightly around her, as if she could shield herself from his presence. "I don't believe you," she snapped. "You don't know what you're doing. I want a real doctor, a white doctor." The words echoed in Dr. Richards's mind. The hurt was familiar, yet still, it felt like a punch to the gut. He had dealt with racism before, but this was different. It wasn't just about his skin color. It was about the years of work, the education, the late nights, and the sacrifices he had made to get to this point. It was about everything he had proven to get here. And yet, it was all dismissed because of something he could not change. He stood there, feeling the weight of the situation settle over him. This wasn't just about one patient's prejudices. It was about the systemic racism that still pervaded so many areas of life, including his profession. No matter how much he fought, no matter how many lives he saved, there would always be people like Emily who saw him as something less than human. With a heavy heart, Dr. Richards turned to leave the room. The tension in his chest was unbearable, but he knew there was nothing more to say. "I'll inform the director of your request," he said, his voice calm but hollow. He walked out of the room, knowing that this incident would not be the last of its kind. As he made his way down the hospital hallways, the weight of Emily's words stayed with him. He had fought so hard to be seen as more than just a black doctor, but in moments like this, it felt like none of that mattered. And as he prepared for the battle that was sure to come, he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't just fighting for his career anymore. He was fighting for his dignity, his humanity, and his right to be seen for who he truly was. Dr. Samuel Richards felt like his world was slowly unraveling. The lawsuit filed against him by Emily Reed had consumed everything. It was no longer just about a single patient or an isolated incident. It had become a battle for his entire career. No matter how many lives he saved, no matter how much evidence he had to prove he did everything right, none of it seemed to matter. In the eyes of many, the accusations against him were enough to tarnish his reputation forever. He couldn't escape the feeling that the color of his skin was the real reason he was being targeted. The first few days after the lawsuit were a blur. Dr. Richards had been forced to focus not just on saving lives, but also on navigating the turmoil surrounding him. His colleagues' glances had grown more distant, some of them avoiding eye contact altogether. He could feel the subtle shift in the air, the whispers that followed him down the hospital hallways. It was as though he had become a different person, to them, someone defined by the accusations, not his skill or dedication as a surgeon. He knew the battle ahead would be long and draining. The legal system didn't always work in favor of the truth. Sometimes it was about perception, not facts. And right now, the perception was that Dr. Richards was a negligent doctor, that he had let his biases affect his work. Nothing could have been further from the truth. And that was the battle he had to fight, against not just the legal claims but the perception that had taken root in people's minds. On the third day after the lawsuit was filed, Dr. Richards sat in a conference room at the hospital. He was meeting with Elizabeth Daniels, the hospital's lead attorney who had been assigned to help him through the legal battle. The atmosphere was tense, and the weight of the situation hung heavily in the room. Elizabeth had been supportive, but she had also been brutally honest. "Dr. Richards," she said, her voice calm but firm, "the accusations against you are serious. They're claiming medical negligence and racial bias. We need to prepare for a long, hard fight, but we've got the facts on our side. Your surgical notes are impeccable, and the hospital's records show that you followed every protocol to the letter. We just need to make sure we present that in the strongest possible way." Dr. Richards nodded, his hands clenched tightly in his lap. He had been through countless surgeries, saved countless lives, but this was different. It wasn't just about performing another flawless surgery. This was about clearing his name, about proving he hadn't let his race impact his ability to do his job. "I know the facts are on my side," Dr. Richards said, his voice low, "but it feels like that won't matter. No matter how much evidence we have, how many witnesses speak in my favor, people will still believe her. They'll believe she was right to doubt me because of who I am, not because of what I did. And that's the part that gets to me." Elizabeth leaned forward, her expression filled with empathy. "I understand how you feel, but we can't let emotions cloud our judgment. We have to focus on the facts, on the truth. You did your job, you saved her life. Now it's time to make sure the world knows that." But as Dr. Richards left the meeting with Elizabeth, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was more than just a legal battle. It was personal. It wasn't just about proving his medical competence. It was about fighting against the stereotypes and prejudices that had followed him his entire life. No matter how skilled he was, no matter how hard he worked, there would always be people who saw him as less than. And right now, Emily Reed had made it her mission to prove it. That afternoon, Dr. Richards walked into the hospital's legal department for his first official meeting regarding the lawsuit. The legal team was already in place, ready to go over the strategy for the upcoming trial. He took a seat at the long conference table, his mind racing with the possibilities. He had been preparing for this moment, but nothing could have prepared him for the reality of it. Elizabeth stood at the front of the room, her demeanor professional but determined. "We need to gather as much evidence as we can. We'll need testimonies from the nurses who assisted you during the surgery, as well as from the anesthesiologist who monitored Emily's condition. We also need to make sure that we have a clear timeline of events. What happened before, during, and after the surgery. This isn't just about proving that you did nothing wrong. It's about showing that the accusations are baseless." Dr. Richards nodded, his mind already processing the information. He had done everything by the book. There was no doubt in his mind that he had saved Emily's life, but now that simple truth wasn't enough. He had to fight for it. As the meeting progressed, Dr. Richards began to feel the weight of the battle ahead. He wasn't just fighting for his career, he was fighting for his dignity, his humanity. And as the days turned into weeks, he knew that the real fight wasn't just against Emily's accusations. It was against a system that was all too willing to dismiss him because of the color of his skin. The trial was scheduled to begin in just a few weeks. The pressure was mounting, and Dr. Richards could feel it in every part of his body. But there was one thing that kept him going: the truth. He had saved Emily's life. He had done his job, and he had done it well. Now, it was time for the world to see that. But as the trial approached, the tension in the hospital grew. Whispers echoed through the hallways. Patients began requesting to see other doctors. Some of his colleagues seemed to avoid him, unsure of how to navigate the storm that was brewing. It felt like he was walking through a fog, unsure of who to trust or where to turn. One afternoon, Dr. Richards sat in the hospital staff lounge staring at the floor, when a familiar voice interrupted his thoughts. "Hey, Sam." It was Karen Bishop, one of his closest allies in the hospital. She had been a constant source of support, and he was grateful for her presence. "Hey, Karen," he said, offering a small smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. "How are you holding up?" she asked, taking a seat next to him. Dr. Richards let out a heavy sigh. "I don't know anymore. Every time I walk through the halls, it feels like everyone is judging me. I can't escape it. It's like I've become defined by this lawsuit, by these accusations." Karen placed a hand on his shoulder. "You're not alone in this. We all know the truth. And we're going to make sure everyone else does too." Dr. Richards nodded, but deep down he wasn't so sure. The truth might be on his side, but the world wasn't always kind to those who fought against the system. As the trial approached, he couldn't help but wonder, would the truth be enough to set him free, or would prejudice win once again? The fight for justice had just begun. The days leading up to the trial were the hardest of Dr. Samuel Richards' life. The accusations of negligence and racial bias hung over him like a dark cloud. Though his colleagues knew the truth, many seemed unsure whether to stand with him or avoid the storm. Whispers in the hallways and patients requesting to see other doctors made him feel increasingly isolated. It was a fight for more than just his career. It was a battle for his integrity, his identity, and the very trust he had worked so hard to build. The courtroom was tense as Dr. Richards sat at the defense table, his hands clasped tightly together. His legal team, led by Elizabeth Daniels, had worked tirelessly to prepare for this day. The evidence was on his side. His surgical notes were impeccable, the witnesses testified to his professionalism, and his colleagues stood by him. Still, the weight of the trial was crushing. In the back of his mind, he couldn't shake the nagging thought that no matter what the facts said, there would always be people who would question him because of the color of his skin. The trial began with opening statements. Tom Richards, the lawyer representing Emily Reed, stood up first, and Dr. Richards could feel the sting of his words even before they were spoken. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Tom began, his voice steady and convincing, "this case is about trust. Emily Reed, a patient who entrusted her life to a doctor, was betrayed by that trust. We will show that Dr. Richards failed to perform his duties properly, and we will prove that racial bias played a role in the negligent care she received." Dr. Richards' stomach twisted as Tom continued to weave his narrative. It didn't matter that he had done everything by the book, followed every medical procedure, and saved Emily's life. In the eyes of Tom, and, he feared, in the eyes of the jury, he was already guilty. The accusations weren't just about his competence, they were about who he was. Someone judged not for his skills, but for the color of his skin. But then it was Dr. Richards' turn. As he took the stand, his heart raced. He knew this was the moment he had been preparing for. This was his chance to tell the jury the truth, to make them see him for who he really was. He was a doctor who had dedicated his life to saving others, regardless of their race, background, or history. The color of his skin didn't define his ability to save lives. "I understand the accusations against me," Dr. Richards said, his voice steady, "but I assure you I did everything within my power to help Mrs. Reed. Her surgery was complicated, yes, but I followed every procedure to the letter. There was no negligence. There was no racial bias. I did what any doctor would do to save a patient's life." The room was silent as Dr. Richards paused, letting his words sink in. He looked around the courtroom, meeting the eyes of the jury. What Mrs. Reed saw when she woke up wasn't a doctor who had failed her. What she saw was me, Dr. Samuel Richards, a black man. And for her, that was enough to assume I wasn't qualified, that I wasn't capable of saving her life. But the truth is, I did save her life. Dr. Richards could feel the weight of his words, the honesty and vulnerability behind them. It wasn't just about defending himself. It was about confronting the biases that had been ingrained in society, the prejudice that had followed him since his first day in medical school. But he wasn't going to let that stop him. He had spent years proving himself, and he wasn't going to let one patient's narrow-minded views define him. The cross-examination came next. Tom Richards, ever the professional, tried to twist Dr. Richards' words, attempting to paint him as a man driven by bias. But no matter what Tom said, Dr. Richards held firm. He knew the truth was on his side, and he wasn't going to let anyone take that from him. The days in court felt like an eternity. The tension in the room was palpable, but Dr. Richards never wavered. His legal team, including Elizabeth, had presented their case with undeniable clarity. The evidence was irrefutable. The facts were on his side. Finally, after what seemed like an endless wait, the jury returned with their verdict. The room fell silent as the foreman stood up holding a piece of paper. Dr. Richards could feel his heart racing as he waited for the words that would determine his fate. In the case of Emily Reed versus Dr. Samuel Richards, the foreman, began, "We find the defendant not guilty of medical negligence and not guilty of racial discrimination." A wave of relief washed over Dr. Richards. He had won. The truth had prevailed. He had been vindicated, and his career had been spared. But as he sat there, surrounded by his legal team, he realized that the victory wasn't as sweet as he had imagined. Yes, he had fought and won, but the scars of the experience would remain. As he left the courtroom, Dr. Richards couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. He had survived this battle, but there would always be others. There would always be people who doubted him because of his race, but now he knew something important. He could fight back. He had the strength to stand up for himself, and he would continue to do so, no matter what came next. A few days later, Dr. Richards sat in his office reflecting on the trial and the road ahead. He had been through so much, and yet, he knew the journey was far from over. He had faced prejudice, had his character tested, but he had come through stronger than before. His phone rang, breaking his thoughts. It was Karen Bishop, the hospital administrator who had been one of his strongest allies throughout the ordeal. "Hey, Sam," Karen said, her voice warm. "I just wanted to check in on you. I know the trial was tough, but I hope you're doing okay." Dr. Richards smiled, feeling a sense of calm wash over him. "I'm doing better, Karen. It's been a rough road, but I've learned a lot about myself. I've learned that no matter what, I can keep fighting, and I will." Karen's voice was filled with pride. "That's the spirit, Sam. You've always been a fighter, and you've got a lot of people behind you supporting you every step of the way." As Dr. Richards hung up the phone, he looked out the window, watching as the city came to life. The road ahead was uncertain, but he knew he was ready for whatever came next. He had faced his greatest challenge, and he had emerged victorious. Now it was time to continue his journey, one step at a time, with his head held high. Victory was sweet, but the real triumph lay in the resilience and courage to keep moving forward.